Okay, so we are getting back into Punisher Max, my patrons, my lovely patrons. We're getting back into Punisher Max, and this time we finished the first story arc, right, in the beginning, and this point we're moving on to Kitchen Irish. Now, the Punisher is essentially back on the streets, right? That was one of the cool things that kind of came out of it, right? In the beginning was just kind of not really a test bed, but kind of an introduction to what Frank Castle was capable of, right? And it was kind of a big moment. Garth Ennis kind of came out of the gate guns blazing, right? In the sense that and really no pun intended, but in the sense that it was like the federal government trying to find a way to ensnare Frank Castle and it not working. And so that's one of the benefits, right? The story almost immediately feels like it's going to go in the direction of some kind of governmental, espionage story or something like that. No, it's Frank Castle's back in business the way he always was. But what this does is it initially picks up with, the Punisher kind of going about at a local bar and just kind of doing his thing. Now, it's not really him getting lazy or anything. There's a particular reason why he was there. But what he does is he starts talking about the notion of Hell's Kitchen, right? That Hell's Kitchen, at that point in time is called Clinton, that it's not really Hell's Kitchen anymore. And essentially this portion of New York was kind of sliced up and divvied up by the powers that be, right? Either by the government itself, by the local government, or by wealthy individuals, and kind of parceled out, right? So, what used to be these down home mom and pop shops, more locale places were sold off to make way for skyscrapers or super expensive coffee shops and different things like that, and so the local flair was basically sold away in the name of progress. The result of this is that there's a kind of down home feel to this part of New York that Frank Castle could always kind of rely on. And being at that bar, initially, with things kind of going nuts, things kind of popping back up, this sort of safe haven, for the wealthy and whatnot, is basically met with a taste of reality when the whole place gets blown up. Now, the Punisher, this is described in pretty intricate detail, and that's what made Garth Ennis' Punisher run so fantastic, right? He says 1 minute he's leaning forward, the next minute everything's blowing up, and it was that choice to lean forward and take a bite of his food that led to him basically surviving, right? Shards of glass flew an inch over his head. He talks about how the waitress ends up being decapitated, some guys pinned against literally smashed against the wall by the force of the explosion. That there's all kinds of stuff going on there. Not only that, one of the guys is kind of sharded, kind of laden with glass, but there was one individual here who survives. There's this notion where a part of him's kind of caved in, at least around his chest, and the Punisher basically reaches in and pinches his artery in order to essentially keep him from bleeding out. Now, this is one of the important things that was established here by Frank Castle, or at least by Garth Ennis, is that when it comes to Frank Castle, it's very easy to see him as the guy who just goes on shooting rampages, right? And just blows things up and kills people, and that's basically it. The cool thing about Frank Castle is that if you're an innocent, he's not just gonna let you die, right? He's not just gonna look on as you die and then leave and go after whoever was that did it. He'll do what he can to save your life if he believes your life's worth saving, right? Now, he kind of makes these judgment calls using a couple of different experience points. The first is this time in the military, learning to differentiate between a person who sustained an injury that can be saved and a person who's essentially mortally wounded. And then a lot of that's also just experience he's learned over the years, right? But in this instance, saving this guy's life, he grabs a fireman, he's like, help this kid, and then basically kind of goes about his business. Now, what he's doing is he's essentially leaving and then coming back, because at the moment, one, he doesn't want to be there because the belief is that he's going to be the one that was behind it. The reason why the Punisher was at this bar is that this was one of the last safe havens, one of the last refuge for the scum of Hell's Kitchen, right? It's where the criminals congregated, all that kind of stuff. Now, that's one of the important things to get about Frank Castle is, yes, he could have gone into this pub, and yes, he could have shot this place up and killed a whole bunch of different criminals. But it's one of these things where Frank Castle is exceedingly smart about what he does. Let the small fish go to catch the big fish later, and then kill the small fish later. That's kind of what he does. That's kind of how he functions here. And what he had intended to do, after getting a body count, which is basically 11 dead and 30 injured, the idea was to essentially eavesdrop on the cops and find out who did this, right? Get some information on who it was that did this, and then kind of go forward from there. The issue is that the cops don't really have a whole lot of information to offer outside of the fact that it looks like it was done by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Now, the big question is, why would the Irish Republican Army be operating inside the United States? And so what we end up doing here is picking up with a couple of guys talking to a man named Finn. Now, Finn is really more of an interesting character, but the only real thing that comes out of this is that he was the guy behind it, right? He was the guy who was behind the bombing, the guy who seems to have been part of the IRA at some point in time, right? Now, there is going to be a lot of information that comes out of him, but, this guy is an extremist, right? This guy is an absolute fanatic. And so what you end up doing is picking up with the Punisher as he kind of goes on this mission, this crusade, to find out who it was that pulled all this off, right? Because the Punisher doesn't really know what's going on, behind the scenes. And so what he does is kind of reminisce about people who were sentimental about the Westies. Now, the Westies was the name of a gang. It was not a location. It was actually the Irish mob based out of New York. And they were some pretty heavy hitters back in the day. And that's one of the things the Punisher hits on. They were really, really big on brutality. They didn't quite know what to do when it came to having any kind of foresight, right? And so when the Italian mob moved in, that there was some gang warfare that went on, but ultimately the Westies were pushed out. Essentially, way was made for the Italians to take over everything. And so with that being the case, we end up learning this place that the Carey's Castle Bar belonged to a guy named Tommy Toner. And Tommy Toner, he and his guys kind of believe themselves to sort of be the inheritors of the Westies, right? To kind of be the guys who would reignite this flame of the Irish mob based out of New York and sort of calling the shots and trying to make these things happen, make these things go down and all kinds of stuff. And so the result of this is that the Punisher initially intends to take out all these guys when suddenly a van appears out of nowhere, snatches up Tommy Toner after killing his guys who were there, and then Punisher ends up bailing out, right? Now, Punisher did not really intend to kill Tommy Toner. The idea was to take out his guys and then basically torture Tommy Toner to get information, right? That he would know who was behind it, or he would be able to share whatever information he has with Frank Castle, and then Frank Castle would probably kill him. The problem is that's not really an option now. So what we end up doing is switching over to an old man in the park. Now, this old man's, of course, watching his grandson have an amazing time, and the guy seems pretty gentile and pretty relaxed, when suddenly he's met by a pretty menacing looking guy. And this guy simply refers to him as Napper. Now, the old man is just, initially it was kind of like, okay, he's calling him Napper because like he's an old man and he takes naps, and menacing looking guy's just giving him shit. No, there's an actual idea behind it. This guy is a guy named Napper French, and Napper French would do what was called pulling Houdinis, which is to say he would make people vanish. And that was par for the course back in the day, right? Like back in the day when the mob had a lot more control and a lot more influence over society than it does now. What you had is you would have some pretty harsh situations unfold, right? Somebody who owed money to the mob, or like some aspect of the mob would move in, or like the mob would first show up or something like that. To make a point, they might wrap that person in cellophane, chop them into pieces, or cut them into pieces and then wrap them up in plastic and then like leave them in different places just to kind of send a message. And that's really what Napper French did, right? He was the guy who would do that. He's a guy who would chop you up and then wrap you in plastic and then send you to like mail you to different locations. And so when the idea is like, look, man, like I know who you are, I know the kind of things you've done, you're gonna start working for me now, suddenly the old man's attitude changes. And it's like, okay, listen here, you motherfucker, like I don't know who you are, but like you're not bringing that shit to my doorstep, right? Like it immediately changes, right? He's not this kindly old man that we thought he was. Like the guy's pretty hardcore. And so what this menacing looking guy ends up doing is basically revealing that they have, Napper French's grandson in a vehicle. They basically have him in a van. Now, of course, from there, we know just by looking at this van, they're the same guys who took off with Tommy Toner. And so what you end up getting is basically Napper French kind of being press ganged into this role of returning to his old ways of making people vanish, right? And we end up finding out this guy is Vigilante. Now, Vigilante, and this one of the reasons why I kind of held this off, Vigilante is the target of Finn, right? Finn has been trying to take this guy out. Now, the indication here is that Finn is trying to carve out an entire section of New York for himself, right? That what he's trying to do is find a way to operate in New York. Setting that bomb off was designed to take out pretty much all the competition, right? They were hoping Tommy Toner would be there. They were hoping Vigilante would be there. It was a huge gamble, right? To hope that like these leaders of the mob would be there in some form or fashion. But even if it didn't work out that way, they still reduce a pretty good chunk of their number. Now, the downside to this is we are talking about New York. People are always struggling in New York. And when somebody shows up on your doorstep with a great big huge package of drugs and says, I'll give you $1,000 to run this up to that place down there, and I'll kill you if you don't, well, then suddenly there's your job. Like there's your new mule running your drugs. And then suddenly you start expanding a little bit more. And then you're right back to where you were before you were hit in the first place, right? So Vigilante really kind of seems to be this guy who's pretty intense, right? This guy who's pretty hardcore. And he really kind of presents us with this sort of extremely intense situation. Now from here, we pick up with a couple guys. The first guy is named Yorkie Mitchell, and the second guy is named Andy Lorimer. Now, Andy Lorimer is the younger guy, and both of these guys are essentially not from the States, right? They're from Britain. And they're kind of having this conversation where they're basically talking about like what different phrases mean here, right? For example, like fag. So if you go over to Britain, fag means a cigarette, right? Like it's not uncommon to hear somebody walk up to you and say, do you have a fag? Whereas here in the States, it's an offensive term for individuals who are homosexual, right? And that's one of the things that, Yorkie kind of tells Andy here, like you can't use that phrase here because it means something totally different, right? You walk up to somebody and you ask them that, they're going to punch your daylights out, right? So like, be careful how you do things. Fun fact, there's actually a really cool YouTube channel that's designed for nothing other than to basically tell you what the customs and the norms are for countries overseas if you choose to travel there. It's amazing. Like it's a super cool YouTube channel. But, in the middle of all this, these guys are basically met by the arrival of Frank Castle. Now, at this point, we jump back to Vigilante along with Napper French and their grandson. And Napper French initially tries to kind of plead his case, right? He hasn't done this in 30 years, right? He's been retired and says like, look, I don't really want to have any hand in this. I don't really want to do this. But the alternative is they kill his grandson. And so where he starts to kind of barter and say, look, it can't just be done as easily as you're asking. You don't just take a hatchet and just start chopping a person up. You got to have different kinds of knives, right? You got to have like a carving knife, things like that, because what we're doing is the equivalent of like breaking down a pig or like a steer, right? Different knives serve serve different purposes. You got to have tools to cut through bone. You got to be able to get through that muscle, that sinew, all that kind of stuff. It's not super easy to break down a human body in that way. And so the response of these guys is, well, then here's a bag of knives from Crate and Barrel. Get to work. And so they basically end up taking the kid into the next room at the behest of Napper French. And then he starts to get to work on Tommy Toner, right? Just like cutting this guy into pieces. Now, as far as Magenti goes and what his motivation is, this really kind of seems to be him just establishing himself, right? So you guys see how ruthless these gangs are, that it's really just making a point, right? Cutting him into pieces and just mailing different parts of him out all over the place and essentially calling it a day, right? Just being like, here's our thing, here's what we're gonna do. And so what you end up doing is you end up picking back up again with Yorkie Mitchell and Andy Lorimer talking with Frank Castle. And what we get is the story of Finn, right? Now we don't get like the full on details. We're just kind of given some general indication of what it is, or at least what it is that he's about. Now, one of the things that we learn is Finn is a guy who's really an extremist insofar as he never really liked the idea of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement as it's called sometimes, was basically an agreement that was signed in April of 1998 that ended, that was essentially an armistice. It was a ceasefire regarding a lot of the Northern Ireland violence and the IRA's actions that have been going on since the 1960s, right? When Northern Ireland was still an occupied territory of Britain, the IRA kind of fought this extreme revolutionary battle in arguing that like they were basically, they weren't allowed to like be their own nation, you know, able to do their own thing. My knowledge is not extremely good on it. And if any of you patrons watching this are really knowledgeable about like the history of the IRA, post some comments and let me know, because like I love learning about that kind of stuff. But the overall gist is that for some extreme individuals, they looked at the Good Friday Agreement and saw it as capitulation. They saw it as one of these things where it was more of Northern Ireland and these Irish forces basically settled, right? Just kind of like, you know, not really getting any kind of real victory here, but basically sort of sitting down and saying, okay, you know, like you stay away, I stay away, that kind of a thing. The issue with this is that in their extreme nature, what they wanted was an absolute full victory. And so what this did is it led to the rise of guys like Finn Cooley, right? That he basically ran this kind of active service unit in Londonderry, and he was jailed for multiple murders. Ultimately, he was freed as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. But the significance of this is that because he was freed, he immediately bailed out of Britain, right? And the idea was that information had been sent to the British government that he had arrived in Canada and had the intention of arriving into the States. Now, the response of the Punisher is, why wasn't anybody told about this? And the response of Britain is, we didn't really expect anything to come out of this guy, right? Like we expected this guy was done, right? His side lost. That was basically what it was, right? I mean, the extremists lost. It was more of the moderates who essentially won. They found a kind of common ground with the British government, at least that's how the argument was presented. And then in turn, here they are, right? And so as a response to that, what really what's going on here and the kind of concern of the British government is that if this turns into a full-fledged thing, then what it means is that Finn Cooley would rise to prominence and Finn Cooley would introduce a whole new level of violence in Hell's Kitchen, right? By basically inciting a lot of those individuals who were Irish that have extreme views that seem to have some kind of ties or beliefs that fall rank and file with extreme Irish members of society in Northern Ireland, trying to find a way to basically kind of bring back a revolution of sorts, right? To make their battleground in New York and then sort of go from there. The long and short is Finn Cooley would introduce a whole new level of violence that New York just hadn't really experienced up to that point, right? It would make the local gangs look like kids with pop guns. And so with that being the case, the response is like, we got to take this guy out quick and fast. Now, as for why it is that Yorkie Mitchell and Andy Lorimer are here is because they've been sent here to keep an eye on Finn to see if he's back up to his old antic. And the fact that he's detonating bombs, different things like that, looks like that was the case. And so at this moment, it's the task of Frank Castle to track this guy down and to basically deal with it. Now, it's also one of these interesting things that go on. Andy Lorimer doesn't really fully understand what's going on insofar as when Yorkie's talking to Frank Castle, the two of them kind of seem to have history. Frank Castle says, make sure this is a one-off. Do not come back here again. And the response of Yorkie is, you got it, man. I appreciate it. You know, and to see that kind of scenario where Frank Castle seems to be the guy running the shots shows us how significant Frank Castle is. The fact that Andy Lorimer doesn't get it as one of these things where it's like, it's Frank Castle, man. I promise you, this is not a guy that you want to pick a fight with, right? We don't want to start shit with this guy. This guy can come to it all, right? And so what this does is it switches back over to Finn and his guys having this kind of conversation, right? Finn Cooley and his guys talking about everything going on. And what their goal to do, or at least what their goal is to basically kind of move forward and continue taking out these various forces who are there, right? These various rival gangs and so on and so forth, to eliminate these guys, to put them out to pasture, and then to kind of, you know, set up shop here and begin, you know, kind of rallying people to their cause, you know, and going to an Irish bar, you know, it's not really for the purpose of recruitment, but it is because it's a safe place, right? Because going to an Irish bar is one of these things. If you're not one of us, you don't come here, right? That's just kind of the way that works. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that, walking into the wrong bar because the bar is just not meant for people like you. I've done that before. It's a little awkward. If it's one of the, like, I can kind of look around and be like, okay, so like this bar is not really conducive to people with my skin color, right? So like, all right, let's go ahead and find a bar that's a little more friendly, but it's a little deeper than that, right? It's kind of a place of, this is our territory, this is our land, right? So it's like going to bars that only black folks can go to and like nobody else can get in, right? So there's a kind of comfort feeling that sort of comes with that. It's fucked up, but like there's a kind of comfort feeling that comes with that. The issue with this is that Finn Cooley is viewed by some of these folks here as being a revolutionary, as being a hero, right? A person whose ideologies they can all champion. And so where it really seems this is the kind of bar that he can find a home in, but also find recruits in, all this really seems to kind of go belly up in an instant. And the reason why is because a door opens and a voice comes out of nowhere and says, anybody not wanting to die for Ireland, get the fuck out. And it's the Punisher. Punisher's like, I'm gonna kill Finn Cooley. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for being patrons. I almost did the outro for Comics Explained again. I'll eventually get better at it. But thank you guys for being patrons. I love you guys to death, and I will see you guys next week for Punisher Max Part 5. Peace.